Today I'm going to be reviving this old PC that I recently picked up from eBay, and I'll only be using a budget of $50. Let's see if we can bring it back to life. It's a really old machine, maybe in the past it has been used for office work, but I will be upgrading and using it for gaming and testing popular titles like League of Legends, Minecraft, CS2, Fortnite, GTA 5, and lastly, I will be putting it to the ultimate test against a modern game like Cyberpunk to find out if this old office PC can survive the heat. But first we need to check if this PC even turns on. Surprisingly, I did not get scammed and the PC gives us a post. Checking the specs, we can see an i5-4570S. It's an old 4-core processor from the Haswell family that has been launched back in 2013. It has a base clock of 2.9 GHz and a turbo boost of up to 3.6 GHz. Unfortunately, we have no hyper-threading, and this CPU would not be the best option for multitasking. The processor has been designed for light tasks and office work, but today I'm going to be putting it to the test and see what this old beast is capable of. We've also got 4GB of DDR3 RAM clocked at 1600 MHz. This is nowhere enough to run games, so we'll definitely be upgrading the RAM. And surprisingly, we have an SSD. I'm surprised to see an SSD in such an old PC. Maybe the seller upgraded so that he can actually use the PC for light work. And for the GPU, we've got an iGPU Intel HD graphics 4600. I remember gaming on a similar iGPU back in 2012 on my old laptop, and it wasn't the greatest experience. So we'll be needing a dedicated GPU as my experience back in 2012 wasn't the best. Let's open up this bad boy and see what we are dealing with on the inside. We've got a single stick of RAM and 3 empty slots. 4GB of RAM is not ideal, but it gives us enough space to upgrade the RAM. I'm thinking of getting 2 additional RAM sticks that we can fit into our budget of $50. This should be an easy task as DDR3 RAM is really cheap and most people are just trying to get rid of it. We have one of those old power supplies which is surprisingly good and has a gold rating of 80+ efficiency, but the power output is limited to only 280 watts, and it does not have any 8-pin or even 6-pin cables that we can use for a dedicated GPU, which puts us in a tricky spot as now we need to find a good low-profile GPU that we can fit into our budget. Looking for low-profile GPUs that do not require any external power can be a bit difficult and even expensive, but we still have some budget options that we can work with. For example, the GTX 1050 Ti, GTX 1650 and the RTX 3050 6GB version, but I highly doubt that we'll be able to get our hands on an RTX 3050 under $50. So that leaves us with only 2 options, the GTX 1050 Ti and the GTX 1650. Ideally, I would want to find a 1650 as this will give us 40% more performance, which means more FPS in most games. Searching on eBay, I was not able to find a GTX 1650 that would fit into our budget of $50, so I had to go with the weaker option, the GTX 1050 Ti, and I was able to find one for $35 including shipping. And I also picked up a 16GB kit of DDR3 RAM with a speed of 1600 MHz. Now that we have our parts ready, it's time to upgrade this old office PC and bring back some life to it. Installing the GPU is straightforward. We just plug it into the PCIe slot and hope that it works. I then added the additional RAM, which brings us to a total of 20GB of RAM, and that is plenty of enough to run most games. The first game that we're going to test is Minecraft. At first we're seeing some stutters and the CPU is being heavily utilized at 100% and being the bottleneck of the system. But once the chunks have loaded up, we can see our FPS has rocketed to 250 and even going up to 300 FPS. The gameplay so far is very smooth and this is on 8 chunks. Now let's test fancy settings and moving up the chunks to 16. Well, this is horrible. The CPU is not doing so great and it takes us a few seconds for the chunk to load up and for the FPS to stabilize. But can't really complain as this is a 12-year-old CPU. On the bright side, once the chunks are loaded, we can see an FPS increase of 200 and even up to 250 FPS on fancy settings at 16 chunks. However, we're seeing some significant drops of FPS, and it is dropping down to 70 when new chunks are being generated, which can definitely impact your gameplay. Now let's test the lowest possible settings and move the chunks to 2. This gives us a significant FPS boost, and at times we're hitting over 500 FPS when sitting in one place. Now I know that nobody would be playing on 2 chunks, so let's put it back to something more realistic as 8 chunks, which is a good middle ground for this GPU and CPU combo, as it gives us over 300 FPS and at times reaching the 400 mark. The gameplay feels very smooth on 8 chunks, and we're barely getting any FPS drops, and this would be my recommendation for Minecraft on such kind of a node setup, as going over 8 chunks causes significant FPS drops that could potentially give you a seizure. Moving on to League of Legends. On full HD resolution at very high settings, we are getting a solid 100 frames per second, with some drops to 80. FPS drops seem to be very frequent here, so let's lower the settings to medium as to stabilize it more. On medium settings, we can see that the average FPS is 115 with some drops down to 80. However, I don't like those dips in performance, so let's set the settings to the lowest possible, and we can see now that the FPS goes up to 125, which is not really any significant improvement. But what we're trying to improve here are the FPS drops, as League of Legends can be a very team fight heavy game, and when a lot of characters are fighting at the same time, it can cause further FPS drops, and ideally during those team fights, you want to avoid any FPS drops so that you can actually play the game. Now on low settings, the gameplay has been stable and we're sitting around 120 FPS. This is definitely a playable setup for League of Legends, but I wouldn't recommend running more than medium settings with this CPU and GPU combo. Moving on to CS2 on high preset, we are seeing an average FPS of 70 and it goes up to 85. The gameplay so far feels very smooth and playable, except the moments of FPS drops that we're getting here and there, and it is going down to 50 FPS, which can significantly impact your gameplay in a game such as CS2. Let's crank down the settings to low in hopes of getting something more stable. On low preset, we are seeing some FPS boost of up to 90 and at times hitting the 100 FPS mark, which is much more playable as we're getting less of those FPS dips. If you have a similar setup, I would recommend running the game in low settings to avoid those awful FPS drops and improve the stability. I'm horrible at this game, but it definitely feels playable and you can surely play some casual matches, but for anything competitive and more serious gameplay, I would not recommend this setup even in low settings, as we can barely hit 100 FPS, and not only that, but we are seeing frequent FPS drops due to the weak i5 4570S CPU that we have. In Fortnite, while in the sky we're seeing an average of 60 FPS and even the FPS going up to 75. Once we land, the FPS is standing at 60 frames with no drops in performance and the game feels very playable. This is currently at medium preset. However, the more we play and move around, the more we are starting to see those occasional FPS drops down to 40. But we can definitely play the game and it feels smooth. Moving on to another classic, GTA 5. On high settings at full HD resolution, we are averaging 110 FPS and not suffering any significant FPS drops, as the lowest it's getting to is 90 FPS, which is still very smooth. Now, considering that this GPU, the GTX 1050 Ti, is from the era of GTA 5, we are not to expect anything less than excellent performance, which we are getting. And this GPU and CPU combo will be more than enough if you are looking to play some GTA 5. Now moving on to a more modern AAA game, Cyberpunk 2077 Phantom Liberty. Arguably one of the most demanding games out there that you can run, and at low settings and the lowest resolution possible, we are getting somewhat of a playable FPS, but this is a huge struggle for our CPU and GPU. even at the lowest possible settings. You can still get some gameplay done and the storyline seems to be smooth, but the FPS drops that we're getting can get pretty annoying, and if you're someone with no patience, then I do not recommend running Cyberpunk on this setup. But on the bright side, you can still do it and get somewhat of a playable experience, even if not the greatest. Surprisingly, this old PC was able to stand its ground against most games. It only choked in Cyberpunk, but this is to be expected given the fact that the total cost for this PC was $96. We can't really blame it. Now, will you be able to play modern AAA games? Certainly not. But if you are just looking for something cheap to be able to play esports titles and some older games like GTA 5 or Minecraft, then this could be a viable and a good budget option for you, as you can easily find a cheap office PC for about $50 and then upgrade it. Overall, this old HP pre-build still holds its ground in 2026 after the upgrades, and it gets my approval. A very capable old machine that can still run most games and give you somewhat of a stable performance. If you are looking for something around the $100 mark or even less, then I highly recommend this PC setup. But of course, you should not expect any longevity from this old PC, as most of the parts are over 10 years old and are considered obsolete. And probably in a few years, it would be difficult for such kind of a build to survive with all of the Windows updates, constant game updates, and minimum requirements that we are nowadays getting in new games. This PC setup should only be a consideration if you currently don't have anything better to use and you can't really afford to spend that much, but you still have that hunger in you for gaming and are looking to play your favorite titles until you're able to save up money and get yourself a proper gaming PC or perhaps a gaming laptop.